Excellent, excellent. Can you see me okay? I don't see everybody yet. I'm going to move a few things around. Is everybody in class already and ready to go? See, I didn't know that. I'm good. Hey guys, how are you? I'm going to move my setup around a little bit too, so that I can better see you and you can better see me. So I don't want it to look too crooked. I'm wearing my Getty Lee Major League Baseball shirt, so this is pirated from the internet. I want everybody to know that there's probably Getty probably approves of it, but I'm sure Rob Manfred doesn't. So good morning, everybody. How are you? So I got Orioles shirts. How many Nationals fans we got out there today? Just one. Were you up late? Yeah. So I can see from the age range here, how many of you were born in this century as opposed to last century? All of you were born late 90s? Most of you? All right, so all of you have a firm recollection of life before the Nationals or no? How old was the youngest of you when the Nationals were born? Like five? Some of you? Three, four, five, six? You were kids, right? Well, I'm figuring y'all signed up for the class, so you love sports, and you love sports for a long time. So maybe you don't love baseball, maybe you love football or hockey or whatever. But I see some Orioles shirts there, so I'm assuming baseball's a pretty significant part of all of this. So my background is that I've done this since 1991, doing sports radio. So my background goes before Camden Yards. So I walked into Camden Yards the day it opened. I saw 3.6 million people in the city, and I've seen the decay of the city. So I kind of come at it from a Baltimore standpoint to say what was Baltimore's stake in this, what did the state and the city and my parents and me as a young taxpayer, what did we pay for the Orioles to be here and Camden Yards to be here? And I mean the history. I don't have any of you read the MASN series that I did for dummies? Nobody's read it. Okay, well then that's a good basis from that'll be some homework if you want some extra reading material at the end. My wife had leukemia in 2014 and 15, and she battled a long time in the hospital. There's a lot of time on my hands, and I actually did that series. It's a four-part series as part of a book that I did on Peter Angelos called The Peter Principles, and it's really just the history of what I've witnessed in. It's my 28th year of doing sports radio in Baltimore. I began in December of 1991 with Kenny Albert. You all are sports fans. You're familiar with Kenny. Kenny was here in Baltimore as a Skipjacks, not reporter. He was their play-by-play guy, and I was the reporter for the Evening Sun when Barry Trotz coached the Skipjacks back in the 80s. And I wound up on the radio in 91. It was kind of a weird time because it was December of 91. The Orioles were leaving Camden Yard or leaving 33rd Street and going to Camden Yards. Are any of you familiar with the Orioles' love affair with Baltimore and the last day at 33rd Street? Have any of you ever seen the video of that in 1991? They actually picked up home plate and dug it out of 33rd Street, and they had a motorcade in a limousine take home plate from 33rd Street. I mean, it was like live news with a helicopter that they were placing home plate from 33rd Street and moving it to Camden Yards. I mean, Baltimore had such a love affair with baseball that I see your Orioles shirt in the middle. Hi, that's what is that? Was it got a number on just a plain shirt? Jonathan Scope. Okay. My favorite one was the Felix Pie because it said pie on the back. And I could go around with an 18 pie shirt on. But I have a Buck Showalter. I have a couple of them around here. The Brad Bergeson was one of my favorites along with the bobblehead. So I always liked the guys that sucked. I mean, anybody can hit 30 home runs. You give a shirt away. But when they give a shirt away and you were like the backup outfielder who was optioned out to Norfolk before they gave the shirt away, that's when I want to collect the bobblehead. So my background is in loving sports and loving the Orioles, and my last name's Aparicio. The reason that I exist and the reason I'm here and I'm pro-immigration and probably anti-Trump is that I'm Venezuelan, and my cousin is a baseball Hall of Famer, and he was dealt from the Chicago White Sox in the middle of a Hall of Fame career to the Orioles in the 1960s. My cousin, Luis Aparicio, brought my father, who shares my name, to America in 1964 and 65. My father married an American, had me, and my father went back to Venezuela in the late 70s. And I grew up here loving baseball. So baseball's been my whole life. I worked at the newspaper when I was 15 years old, 1984, when Camden Yards was just a shadow. So I'll take you back to the 80s and just give you a little bit of a primer, especially, coming that it's the morning after the Nationals have won a World Series, which is, Sam, is that incomprehensible to you? How far back do you go with that? The concept of the Washington Senators. I mean, I'll let you answer some of this because what the perception of baseball in Washington was that it could never work. It didn't work. The Twins were born out of the Senators' ineptitude in the early 60s, and then the Rangers were born out of the Senators and Bob Short's ineptitude in the early 70s. Washington is a two-time failed baseball market. This is so y'all are familiar with St. Louis as a town, right? St. Louis has lost two football teams in my lifetime, right? This would be them getting another team back 10 years from now, and the St. Louis Bears winning a football championship, or Jaguars winning a championship in 2035. That's what we're talking about. Like, would any of you move a football team to St. Louis right now? No, you would not, because it's failed twice, right? And so the Washington Nationals, or the Senators, is what they were always known as in my childhood. It was a twice failed market, and in 1991, Camden Yards was. I was getting on the radio. Camden Yards was opening in the spring, and there were 3.6 million people coming. The miracle of all of this is that baseball left D.C. in 71, 72. 79, Oriole Magic was born, and in 1979, the team was sold from a beer magnate named Gerald Hofberger, who could never figure out how to make money. The Reggie Jackson, all the free agency that happened in the late 70s with Doug DeCinces and with Bobby Grich and with Wayne Garland, all these guys, Reggie Jackson left, Don Baylor, these great players of the Oriole way left, and there was no money here. So there was a real baseball economic disparity. I would highly encourage all of you, if you love baseball, if you really want to learn, I get my knowledge from reading other people's work. I mean, Tom Boswell's a great example, somebody that's written about baseball for 50 years. But Lords of the Realm, there's a book called Lords of the Realm by John Hellier, Helyar. It was written in 1992, 3-4, right before the strike, and it was about the history of baseball and labor. And really the story of baseball and the history of baseball is about labor and the Players Association fighting with the owners, and there being a lot of money and moving parts, and the players trying to get at that money. In the 50s and clearly in the 40s, I see some people of color in the crowd. You wouldn't have been allowed to play Major League Baseball because they were all racist in the 40s. In the 50s, they'd let you play. They were still racist. And you can ask Frank Robinson and Hank Aaron and anyone else about that. The reason Frank Robinson wound up here and my cousin wound up here in the 1960s as future Hall of Fame players, the reason they were dealt to Baltimore is they were uppity. My cousin couldn't get along with Bill Veeck in Chicago because he wanted $500 more. Frank Robinson couldn't get along with the Cincinnati Reds people because they were primarily racist and then were sold to another racist owner named Marge Schott. And you can do a little math on Schott, Marge Schott. She had swastikas and once called Dave Parker her $1 million N-word. So Google the history of racism in baseball, and you'd understand a little bit more about that as well. But in the 70s and then early 70s, there was major labor discord. For all of you seeing Colin Kaepernick right now being blackballed by the NFL, go back and Google Curt Flood, Flood, Curt with a C, Curt, Curt Flood. A lot of this is written about in Lords of the Realm. But free agency was the biggest issue in the early 70s. The players couldn't move from one organization to the other unless they made themselves a complete pain in the ass to get dealt. Steve Carlton's probably the greatest example, and he was Caucasian, that he couldn't get along with Augie Bush in St. Louis. He was a 20-game winner. He was the best pitcher in baseball, and they dealt him to the depths of hell. Any of you from Philadelphia? That would have been the depths of hell in 1971 or 72 because they were the Orioles. They were losing 100 games a year. Steve Carlton won 27 games in 1973. His team only won 54. Do the math on that. So as it goes, in the early 70s, free agency was really the issue for baseball, and all of the fighting that happened was about player salaries and player freedom. And in 1979, Gerald Hoffberger couldn't make a go with the Orioles, so he sold the team to Edward Bennett Williams. So Edward Bennett Williams was a hotshot lawyer from Washington, D.C. D.C. had lost the team in 1971, and in 1979, he bought the team. And Larry Lucchino told me this story, that the night that he bought the team, he went to a restaurant in Washington, and the waiter came up to the table. Like, it was a foregone conclusion that if Edward Bennett Williams bought the Baltimore Orioles in 1979, it was only a matter of time before they wound up in D.C. D.C. was the bigger market. D.C. had the Capitol Center and the Capitals and the Bullets. The Redskins were throwing off revenue at that time, and it was screaming for baseball. And Baltimore could never really afford baseball, and they were playing in this dump, 33rd Street. The most painful thing happened not on the baseball side, but on the football side, because in 1984, Bob Irsay moved the Colts. So when the Colts were moved out of Baltimore in March of 1984, Edward Bennett Williams was 5 years into owning the Orioles. The Orioles won the World Series in 1983. The Orioles were the best team in baseball in 1981 in the strike season, and I go back to labor. In 1981, there was a massive baseball strike. It created a split season. And the Orioles were the second best team in the American League East in both halves. They had over 100 wins and didn't make the playoffs. In 83, they came back and won the World Series, and then the guys got old, and then bad things started to happen, and they started to lose, and they got into free agency. But what really stoked this on was the Colts leaving in 84 opened this lane now for the state of Maryland, for Baltimore to say, amidst our tears in the Mayflower vans and watching the Colts play in the Dome out in Indianapolis, we can't lose the Orioles, right? We can't lose the Orioles. So the state of Maryland went into overdrive. Mayor Schaefer became Governor Schaefer. They appropriated a bunch of money. Edward Bennett Williams was magnanimous in all of this. Like, he was not a jerk. He clearly could have made more money, or the perception that he was going to make more money in D.C., but he was a man of substance, a man of character, and said, I'm not going to break Baltimore's back. They just lost the Colts. I'm not moving the Orioles. I'm not going to be that guy. He saw how Irsay was vilified. He knew that if he moved the team 35 miles away, Baltimore would revolt. Baltimore hated the Redskins and still does. Why they don't hate the Nationals, that's going to be for you and me to figure out over the next 45 minutes. But I'm giving you some history on this. So in 1987 and 88, the state went into full overdrive. They thought they were going to sue the league. They thought the Colts were coming back, that there was some eminent domain. It was all of this goofiness of the Colts losing 14 games a year and playing in Indianapolis in 84, 85, 86, and the Orioles going into the toilet on the field that begat Camden Yards. Camden Yards is one of the most ambitious civic projects that the state has ever taken on to save a baseball team. And you can talk about Port Covington now and other developments that happen here, but all of the money was in D.C. The state of Maryland, there was a big movement to put that stadium in Columbia or in Laurel or somewhere on 95 or somewhere that represented sort of the midway point that would be that Minneapolis, St. Paul, Fort Worth, Dallas thing. And everybody in Baltimore was against that. Mayor Schaefer was against that. So what happened was, all of you have been to Camden Yards, yes? Everybody in the room? So in 1987 or 88, there was a fight in Annapolis, and they appropriated $300 million to build Camden Yards. And it was on tax bonds, it was on lottery money, and then there was the fight of where they're going to put the stadium. And for any of you familiar with Port Covington, and I just sat down with the mastermind of Port Covington, a guy named Mark Weller. I do a thing called Baltimore Positive that I would encourage all of you to check out as well, about saving the city. And Camden Yards, the money was appropriated. Then the fight was not in my neighborhood, or I need it in my neighborhood, or what's best for Baltimore. And Governor Schaefer was always best for Baltimore was what he wanted to do. And there was all of this land down in Port Covington that you guys now see, where the Sun Park is on the south side, where the cruise ships come in. there was a thought to put the stadium down on the water and make that the neighborhood, much like what Anacostia. All of you have been to Nationals Park? All of you are old enough to remember before it existed, maybe in some way? Maybe you don't because you didn't go into that neighborhood. It wasn't a place anybody went. So the vision of what is now Half Street and what is now that neighborhood that's, somebody declared it one of the top 10 neighborhoods in the world, literally, because it's in Washington, D.C., for upward mobility. If you want to make an investment in a $500,000 condo that might be $1 million condo, that is the area to do it in. So Camden Yards, the biggest issue here was where are you going to put it and what's going to best benefit Baltimore. And Governor Schaefer at one point was the only one that wanted to put it at Camden Yards and attach it to a train station 6 blocks from the harbor. Governor Schaefer saw it as an extension of Harbor Place. And because I literally, and let me see if I can pick up and show you where I live, okay? So this will add probably a little bit. There you go. So if you look behind me, you see what that is? That's Camden Yards, okay? That's where I live. This is my bedroom. This is where. So if you see this, that's the football stadium. That was a parking lot, and that is Camden Yards, okay? So I sit and wake up to it every day. So I see how empty it is when it's empty, and it's been a sickening thing for me. I need to plug my computer back in. So buy me a second here while I duck on you guys because my computer will blow up if it. There we go. Make sure I'm plugged back in. So in 1992, that was built, and it opened up. And it came here because Governor Schaefer literally willed it to come here. And it took a lot of political capital in order to make that happen. And let me put a light on here so you guys don't lose me all the way through. There. That's a little more comfortable where I sit when I usually broadcast, but I was working this morning, so apologies for that. And make sure I get my act together so y'all can see me right. So in 1992, Camden Yards was built and it opened, and it changed the city, right? I mean, it brought 3.6 million people into the city in the summer. It brought 50,000 people a day, 10, 12 times in a row to restaurants, hotels, anyone selling anything, peanut vendors, Philadelphia pretzel vendors would come down and vend pretzels in front of Camden Yards 80 times a year. I knew these guys. I worked around the ballpark. I knew the street hustlers and the scalpers and all of the Oriole magic that came. But this is before the Nationals happened. And all of this came before Peter Angelos was involved. So in the case of Peter Angelos, and I would highly encourage you, again, I've written books on this stuff, so that's why Sam is reached to me. But Peter Angelos came in the summer of 1993 and bought the Orioles. The team was supposed to be sold to Bill DeWitt. And this is where I would encourage you if you really want to learn about sports business and marketing. And my dear friend Marty Conway teaches this stuff for a living at Georgetown. He's one of my guests all the time. And incidentally, Sam, Marty's never asked me to lecture his class, and I know Marty's going to be watching this. So Marty, even though I didn't go to Yale, I can lecture at Georgetown. But so in 1992, Camden Yards gets built. In 93, the team was going to be sold, and the story of Camden Yards is it's more complex than I even realized at the time, and I've been on the radio every day of my life for 30 years. I didn't learn this till about 10 years ago as to how the sale went down. And Larry Lucchino sat for the book and explained it all to me because he was the president of the Orioles at the time. He was sort of the deposed guy. Are you familiar with Larry Lucchino? When I drop his name, does everybody in the room know who he is? Okay. Larry Lucchino was the president of the Orioles for like 15 years. He saw through Camden Yards. He was the one that hired Janet Marie Smith to build Camden Yards. He's the reason Camden Yards sort of looks retro and old school. He was a real he was the number one guy for Edward Bennett Williams. So when I mention Edward Bennett Williams owning the team and wanting to keep the team in Baltimore, it's because Larry Lucchino said that Edward Bennett Williams was a Washington guy who always wanted the team to be in Washington but couldn't break Baltimore's heart after the Colts. Larry said, Ed, we can make this work in Baltimore. We can make the Orioles Washington's team. So in 1979, they started opening an Orioles store in D.C. They started marketing the Orioles to D.C. fans. And unlike Baltimore, who never adopted the Redskins, Washington fully You're in Emmitsburg. Some of you are Rockville people or Gaithersburg people or wherever you're from. You were Orioles fans. Your parents were Orioles fans because the Orioles came down to D.C. with Larry Lucchino and marketed former Senators fans and wanted them. That's how 3.6 million people showed up. These were not Baltimore people. This was George Will, Larry King. These were all the senators and congressmen and all the big D.C. money. All of that money flooded into Baltimore in the 90s at Camden Yards, and Camden Yards was the place to be. It was 45 minutes on the freeway. It was a cute little town. It had history and charm and European flair. It didn't have murder and all the stuff that you think about Baltimore now. Sure, it had murder, but the brand of Baltimore was, if you were from Reston, Virginia, you were willing to endure an hour and 15 minutes of traffic once or twice a month to come up and see your Cal Ripken play, and and to see Jimmy Key pitch, and to see Mike Messina, and to see Roberto Alomar, or to come to see the Yankees play in Baltimore. That was a big deal. See the Red Sox play in Baltimore. That was a big deal in the 1990s. That's why 3.6 million people did it every summer from 92 to 98, and that's why the team was competitive. The 94 strike was brutal, and Angelos buying the team in the summer of 93. So I'll take you back to 93 and 94 and 95 because it's the most important part of the story. It's where all of this got seeded, which was the Lords of the Realm and the strikes of 81 and 87 landed in 94. Angelos bought the team in 93 because the team went into receivership. The team was purchased in the late 80s by a guy named Eli Jacobs. He was a junk bond manager. He owned a company. He owned an audio tape company. How do you think that went at the end? Probably didn't go well. Probably like being in CDs right now, or you guys are even younger than that. I don't know what the next thing that's going to be gone that we're not going to. Drivers, Uber drivers. 20 years from now, 10 years from now, we're going to have Uber drivers. Cars are going to drive themselves. That drives people nuts. But there was the thought of all of this stuff back in the 90s. Baseball was the biggest creature on the block. They were the NFL in the 90s. They were the thing everybody watched. They had the highest TV ratings. They had the history. Everybody collected baseball cards. Everybody wanted to be Mickey Mantle. Cal Ripken was the biggest sports star in our society in the 90s. He played for the Orioles. 3.6 million people came to see him. And the team was for sale. And the owner was going broke. The owner went broke. He knew he was going broke. He bought the Orioles. He actually loved the Red Sox, Eli Jacobs. He bought the Orioles and saw that Camden Yards would triple the value of the investment. He bought them for, I believe it was $45 million, and he sold it for $178 million a year later, or about four and a half years later. So all the documentations, and he bought them in 88, 87, 88, and he flipped it in 93. So, and he made $150 million that he never saw because he was bankrupt. So he went into bankruptcy, and when he went into bankruptcy, the entire team went into receivership in 92. All of the money that was flooding into the franchise in 92, and I'm talking like Camden Yards shirts and hats and stuff, that inaugural season stuff, and all the sponsorship that came with that in 1992, there was a lot of money. He was not allowed to take any of that money. That money stayed in the operating account. And in 1993, Major League Baseball is a cartel, right? So this is where it gets really complex, and this is really how the Nationals were born. Antitrust, I don't know where you guys are on the antitrust thing. This is more pre-law than it is sports marketing or business. But baseball has an antitrust exemption. They've had it for almost 100 years now. They probably shouldn't have it, but they do. And that's how much congressmen revered baseball in the 40s and 50s and 60s in America in the last century. And what a big deal it was is that they got a special set of rules to be a monopoly. And part of that was they picked their own owners. There was never a team that would hit the street that a regular person could bid on. They appointed their ownership and their fiefdom, hence Lords of the Realm. So go read Lords of the Realm by John Hellier. That'll give you a whole lot more education than I can ever give you, because that guy did an incredible job on the book. And the book was written at a really tender time, especially for baseball, because the strike that really annihilated baseball and begat the Washington Nationals happened in 1994. So in 1993, Peter Angelos woke up one morning, and all of this is in the Peter Principles, Chapter 1, and he read that the Orioles were going to be sold to an out-of-town guy, a guy not from around here. The guy's name was Bill DeWitt. He had a partner named Bob Castellini. Bob Castellini now owns the Cincinnati Reds. Bill DeWitt has owned the St. Louis Cardinals for about 2 decades. They were inside guys. They were hand-selected by the Lords of the Realm, led by Bud Selig and Jerry Reinsdorf and George Steinbrenner in the 1990s. And they wanted Bill DeWitt to own the team. He was a minority owner of another franchise, maybe the Texas Rangers at the time, who were owned by George W. Bush. So George Bush owned the Rangers before he was the president. I think he actually did give up the ownership of unlike the guy who owns the hotels everywhere. But in 1993, Angelos woke up and read that the Orioles were going to be sold. The Orioles were absolutely the hottest thing in Baltimore. They had sold 3.6 million tickets. They were having a thing they called the Winter Carnival, and they did this. And this is the marketing part for you guys. So they were selling 3.6 million tickets a year. They would literally open Camden Yards on a Friday night in December. After Thanksgiving, but before Christmas, they would have a Friday night fan fest. And they would put the tickets on sale at like 8 o'clock on that Friday night. And if you wanted a season ticket, you could get in. But if you didn't get a season ticket, it was just going to be a free-for-all for the tickets. And they literally would sell out the entire season on December 10th. So I see the guy in the middle of the Orioles shirt there. That's the Orioles that I'm coming from, bro. You know what I mean? That's where, when I was your age, I was born in 1968. So in 1992, when I was 24 years old, 3.6 million, every one of you would have had an Oriole shirt on right now or an Oriole hat on. You would love Cal Ripken. You would have gone to as many games as you could have gone to last year. And Peter wanted to be the king of Baltimore. So Peter Angelos, and this is all Peter Principle stuff, ran for mayor in the 60s twice and lost. He was a big-time lawyer for unions, and he got this asbestos money. He was a poor Greek immigrant guy from Highlandtown who made good, who had a bar and had a law firm and fought for people and got involved with steel workers and asbestos, and suddenly in 1990 hit a judgment for $400 million and didn't know what to do with it. And he wanted to be famous, and he wanted to be loved, and he wanted to be king, and he thought his manure didn't stink, and he wanted to be a social mover, social climber. And he saw that the Orioles were for sale and found out that a local owner was not involved. And he started fudging up everything. He went to the newspapers. He started blasting that he wanted to buy the team, that it was an outrage, that he's out of town, they're going to come and move the team to Cincinnati. I mean, go look at the bluster of this guy. I did a 1-hour sit-down with him in 1997. It's all up on YouTube. Just Google my name and his name, and it all pops up, WNST. And you can sit and listen to him get drunk at the barn and bark about, let me tell you why there's never going to be a team in Washington, D.C. We don't believe there should be a team in Washington, D.C. And it's a pretty good impersonation if you go and check it out. So I'm actually going to play some of that now that they've won the World Series. I'm going to cut some of that up. But in 1993, he made a lot of noise about out-of-towners making Baltimore a branch town and got involved and started to get on the phone with Jim McKay, Pam Shriver, rich people in Baltimore, landowners in Baltimore, and created a real stink about who would own the Orioles while this other rich out-of-town guy went broke and it wound up in receivership. Meanwhile, the biggest thing in the summer of 1993 was the baseball All-Star Game was in Baltimore for the first time since 1958. So it was a generational thing. It was a reason to buy season tickets because you were guaranteed an All-Star Game ticket. You can go back and Google the 1993 All-Star Game. Pretty forgettable night other than Mike Messina not pitching and somebody climbing the standard and putting a Free Willy banner across the outfield. They would have been shot and gone to jail by then in the modern era. But that night, the team was still not sold. 3 weeks later, the team that had 3.6 million people coming, the biggest brand in American sports. The Dallas Cowboys had just been sold for an incredible $125 million. Nobody had ever heard of a sports franchise selling for $100 million. It was unheard of. Hofberger couldn't make money. Eli Jacobs went into bankruptcy. You'd be crazy to buy this team because it's a sell high proposition. There are never going to be more people at Camden Yards than there are. You're going to get ripped off if you buy the team. So the team went into a bidding situation in New York City. It's never happened before. I mean, can you guys imagine the Jacksonville Jaguars being for sale in a courtroom right now, and ESPN and the NFL Network setting up outside for the 10 a-holes that are in there waving $1 billion trying to buy the team to feed their ego? I mean, that's what this was in 1993. Peter Angelos went in. He lied to Larry Lucchino in a suite at the St. Regis. Instead of it being a bid, he said to DeWitt and Castellini, get in with my bid. We're the Baltimore bid. You guys can be part of the ownership. You'll be part of everything. We'll bring you in. We'll let Larry run the team. They went in. They bought the team. 90 days later, Larry Lucchino was thrown out by his ear. Larry Lucchino had built Camden Yards, built the Orioles, recruited Baltimore, spent 15 years of his life doing that. Larry Lucchino, and I want all of you to Google him right now. I see some of you playing on your phones, your computers. Come on. Larry, Lucchino. He is literally the reason Camden Yards exists. He's the reason the Orioles exist. He's now the reason the Nationals exist. He's a very influential and significant human being. And he also went and built the San Diego Padres. He built Petco Park. He then went to Boston. And if you see a picture, Google Larry Lucchino in rings, an image. He's got a fistful of World Series rings from the Boston Red Sox. So Larry Lucchino was thrown out by Peter Angelos as employee one, never to come back, and the Orioles have never been the same. So in 1994, the strike happened. Peter Angelos went to war with all of his partners. He was the owner who said, this strike thing is nuts. I'm not participating. I'm not hiring scab players. My partners are nuts. Bud Selig's a maniac car salesman. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's a lunatic. And that was Peter's posture toward his partners in the middle of a baseball strike. He had owned the team 9 months in the middle of the baseball strike, and he pissed off everyone in Major League Baseball. So as we sit here the day after the Washington Nationals have a parade, understand that in 1994, the players walked off the job, the owners locked them out, and they went to war, and there was no World Series in 1994. Everyone lost money, but there was one market that really struggled psychologically with a strike, and that was Montreal. Montreal was the best team in baseball in 1994. Go back and Google, Denny Martinez and all their star players back in 1994. Larry Walker, Pedro Martinez, all part of that group. And they didn't finish the season, and the people of Montreal never came back. The people of Montreal never forgave baseball for the strike. And the strike happened in 94, so they came back in April of 94 and they played baseball, or 95 and played baseball. And now Peter owns the team. All of the owners hate Peter. Peter took the side of Cal Ripken. Peter took the side of the players. He was demonstrative. He was loud. He was in the paper every day. He's a jerk by nature, so you can imagine the stuff he was saying. He called Bud Selig a used car salesman. Bud Selig was the commissioner of baseball. Bud Selig was his partner. Bud Selig's the one that let him in the door, and this taught Bud Selig a lesson. We're never going to have a team go to auction again and have this kind of guy in our club. They hated Jeffrey Loria. Jeffrey Loria, by the way, finished in second. Are you familiar with who Jeffrey Loria is? Please Google him. Jeffrey, Jeffria, Loria, Loria. All of you familiar with the Miami Marlins, Florida Marlins? They've won 2 World Series. They have no fans, no friends, no sponsors, and a stadium that no one goes to. That was built with civic money, that was lied to, that everyone in Miami knows that he lied to them. He had his jerk son-in-law named David Sampson piss off everybody from West Palm Beach to the Keys, and now no one goes to Marlins games, and they sold the team to Derek Jeter's group. So Lorio was second place. He wound up getting involved with the Montreal Expos, and they wound up flipping out John Henry's team to the Boston Red Sox, which became Larry Lucchino. So if you Google the history of the Miami Marlins, the Boston Red Sox, the Montreal Expos, the Washington Nationals, and the Baltimore Orioles, you will see they're all intertwined, and they were all placed for ownership by who Bud Selig liked the most. He liked John Henry and Larry Lucchino. They got the Red Sox because that was the best market for them to go make a lot of money, win a lot of championships, and they did. Bill DeWitt wound up in St. Louis, which was his hometown. Bob Castellini wound up in Cincinnati, which is his hometown. But incidentally, it was their money that bought the Orioles for Peter. Peter did not have enough money to buy the Orioles. To get DeWitt and Castellini on his side, he needed their money. He took their money, he deballed them and threw them out. And then he pissed them all off in 1994-95 by taking the players' side in the strike. So in 1995, 96, 97, the Orioles were good. They made the playoffs. Davey Johnson. There was a Donald Trump kind of ownership here for the Orioles in that Peter was in the news every day, on the phone with reporters every day, the lead story of the paper every day. In 1992, 3, 4, Baltimore really wanted football. And Mayor Schaefer was now Governor Schaefer, and Jack Kent Cooke, who, by the way, Larry Lucchino has a Super Bowl ring from the Washington Redskins. He was a key employee there as well in the early 80s. So Jack Kent Cooke was trying to get a stadium built anywhere. And he never wanted a team in Baltimore, a football team in Baltimore. So Jack Kent Cooke was trying to get land in Laurel to move the Washington Redskins, who were playing in RFK Stadium, which all of you have been to RFK Stadium? It was a dump then. It was a dump in 1991 too, okay? So in 1991, he was trying to get a stadium built in Laurel or anywhere. Like, Jack Kent Cooke didn't care whether it was in Reston, whether it was in Laurel, whether it was in Rockville. It was just about, I want a free stadium, which was the gig because Camden Yards was a free stadium. Why shouldn't I get a free stadium, right? So in Laurel, Governor Schaefer said to Jack Kent Cooke, the Washington Redskins will never be in Laurel. I will never build you a road. You will never get infrastructure. You will never move the Washington Redskins into the state of Maryland because that would effectively mean my city will never get a football team. Not happening. So Jack Kent Cooke went to war with Governor Schaefer. Jack Kent Cooke was at the end of his life at that time. And suddenly, Raljon was built in Prince George's County. How many of you have been to FedEx Field? Few of you? Handful of you? All right. You know how it sucks to get in, sucks to get out? Well, that's been true the whole time, too. And the Capitol Center was getting ripped down at that time on the other. The Capitol Center is now the parking lot for it. So in 1995, 6, and 7, Peter Angelos, loved him some Peter Angelos, like Donald Trump. He was in the paper every day. He was holding press conferences. He was making pronouncements. His favorite weapon of choice was the fax machine. He once called Ken Rosenthal. Did y'all stay up late last night? You know who Ken Rosenthal is, right? I was Ken Rosenthal's intern and helper in 1986, 87, 88, 89 at the Evening Sun. When the earthquake happened in San Francisco in 1987 or 89 during the World Series, Ken Rosenthal was at a payphone that worked, dictating copy to me while I got it in the newspaper the next day on a Radio Shack computer. So I've known Ken Rosenthal since 1986. So Ken Rosenthal was the beat writer and the columnist here in 93, 94, 95, 96. And Angelos hated everybody, right? So but he really hated Ken. He called Ken an insolent twit. He called him all sorts of names, but he used a fax machine. And Peter started blustering around. If you Google an event that was a pretty big event in Baltimore's history, it happened in August of 93. It was a preseason football game between the Miami Dolphins, and Don Shula was the coach then, and he had coached the Colts to in Super Bowl III. Super Bowl V. Super Bowl III. Super Bowl III, sorry. And the New Orleans Saints were the other team. Jim Finks was their general manager, and he was the general manager of the Baltimore Stars of the USFL. By the way, if you want to read a great book on sports leagues and marketing and business and Donald Trump, get Jeff Pearlman's book on the USFL. It's fantastic. So in the case of, you guys can still see me, yeah? Okay, I had a little glitch on my computer. So Jack Kent Cooke was trying to get a stadium in Maryland to screw Baltimore out of having a team. Peter Angelos owned the Orioles and was loud and obnoxious. Peter Angelos was trying to buy the Rams, the Raiders, the Buccaneers, primarily the Buccaneers, by the way, and move them to Baltimore. So you can imagine all of this stuff happening in 1993, 94, 95. Jack Kent Cooke gets his stadium built and the money appropriated in PG County. And Baltimore, meanwhile, was the only city with all of this money sitting for a free stadium because Governor Schaefer convinced everybody Baltimore needed to have a football team. That we had been screwed. Look at the way we support baseball. Look at what baseball's done to the Inner Harbor. It's brought 3.6 million people here. The only thing that could complete our city, our manifest destiny, would be to have a football team. And he was going to work tirelessly to make that happen. So Peter, the only way Peter could be a bigger hero than he was in saving the streak for Baltimore and Cal Ripken, I fought for the fans of Baltimore. The only way to make him a bigger hero would be to steal the Rams and bring them to Baltimore, steal the Raiders or steal the Buccaneers or steal the Bengals. By the way, nobody thought of stealing the Browns, just so you know. Like, nobody ever thought the Browns were going anywhere. There were no rumors about the Browns. Art Modell was never the kind of guy that would leave Cleveland, all of that stuff. So in 1993, Baltimore threw this huge football preseason game. It was called the Give Baltimore the Ball Night. There were 3 ownership groups that paraded around Baltimore holding $500 million saying, we want the expansion team for Baltimore. The expansion teams in 1994 were given to Charlotte, Jerry Richardson, who is now left in shame if you can Google him, and a guy named Wayne Weaver, who was a shoe magnate from Jacksonville. Jacksonville and Charlotte beat Baltimore, St. Louis, and Memphis in the expansion derby of 1994. So in 1994, Baltimore's nose was pressed up to the glass with all of this funding, with 3 groups, including the Glazer family, Glazer. They own the Buccaneers now. It included a guy named Boogie Wineglass. You can go check him out as well. He owned a company called Merry-Go-Round. He was one of the original diner guys of Barry Levinson. And they all wanted to buy the expansion Baltimore Bombers football team. They were all left at the gate. Paul Tagliabue never wanted to put a team in Baltimore because he didn't want to screw Jack Kent Cooke. He and Jack Kent Cooke were like this. Tagliabue was a Redskins season ticket holder. Paul Tagliabue was never going to put a team in Baltimore. And if you Google this, and some of you from Baltimore know this, and Sam knows this, Paul Tagliabue famously at the press conference in Chicago after a team was given to Charlotte and a team was given to Jacksonville, Paul Tagliabue stood in front of the Baltimore media and said, maybe you all should go back to Baltimore and build a museum with that money or something, build some schools or something. I was on the radio then, right? So this is summer 94. I'm 3 years into the radio. I'm 26 years old. So any of you 26? A few of you maybe around that age. So I was 3 years into my radio career then. And I remember the day that we didn't get the team. It was devastating. Like, we were never going to have a football team here. I mean, I really want to get you guys around the mind frame of what the Baltimore-Washington thing is, because this is a war that isn't about fans or your Orioles shirt, your national shirt, or your Caps hat in the back. I think it's a Caps hat. This was really... Go Barry Trotz. Screw Ted Leonsis. So anyway, he didn't bring the cup to Baltimore, by the way. He lied to me. Ted Leonsis told me 100 times to my face that when the Capitals won the cup, he'd bring it to Baltimore. He didn't. He lied. Ted, you lied. So I know he'll see this too. So anyway, but I've loved the Caps my whole life, but I can't support anything that's not supporting Baltimore. I mean, I live here. You see where I live? You guys saw where I live? You see how empty the stadium is today? That's how empty it is all 80 nights next summer too. And that's how empty it's been, and it really angers me. So as a citizen and as a taxpayer and as someone that does this for a living and someone that's chronicled the truth that I'm giving to you guys. So Jack Kent Cooke wanted to move the team where Baltimore couldn't have a team. Paul Tagliabue tried to aid him in doing that, right? Protecting him, which is it's what you do. You protect your partners, right? So you put a team in Charlotte, put a team in Jacksonville. Meanwhile, Baltimore would not take no for an answer. And a guy named John Moog was hired by the state of Maryland to procure a football team, a National Football League team for Baltimore. And in October of 1995, we stole the Cleveland Browns. You guys are very familiar with that. It's the reason I'm sitting in front of you. It changed my life. It's the reason Art Modell is on my days. You can see that's Art. You see Art back there? That's Art right there. I keep him there because Art changed my life, and the football team being here changed my life. So, and I'm unabashed about that. But I can't imagine a Baltimore without the Ravens at this point, especially with what the Orioles have become. So in 1995, in October of 95, we got a football team. Camden Yards was in all of its glory, even though the strike had happened. The strike did not hurt the Orioles because Angelos' take on we're going to preserve the streak for Cal Ripken made him a hero at the time. And the Orioles were winning games, and he was spending gobs of money on payroll and didn't care about making money. All he cared about doing was being a hero and winning. He gave a legendarily poor speech during the Cal Ripken game. He stopped the game for 20 minutes and got booed off the stage, and Frank Robinson had to grab him and get him away from the dais. Go watch the video of Peter Angelos' speech from the Cal Ripken night. That was the last time he ever stood in front of the fans. He's still alive, by the way, but he's never stood in front of the... By the way, Ted Lerner coming out the other night. I barely knew what he looked like, but he showed up for the trophy. I noticed that late into the night in Houston the other night. He didn't stand out in front of the franchise much, but he was there the other night. So in 95, Art Modell moves the team here. Peter hated Art. I mean, hated the concept of his parking lot becoming a football stadium. Hated the concept of every single sponsor now having a pitch on their desk to go to a football game in a new stadium as opposed to Camden Yards. Peter hated everything he couldn't control and abused everything he did control. So in 1995, the football team comes. Obviously, in 97, FedEx Field opened. And now the Redskins were going to be the Redskins. The Camden Yards became a two-stadium complex in 98. The Ravens took over in 98, started playing there. And that was right when the time when Peter lost his mind. He signed Albert Bell, and people stopped coming. In 1998, things got very, very sour for Peter. 99, 2000, 2001, you can look at the records and see that they lost a lot of baseball games, right? So in that period of time, Washington started battle drumming about getting a team. There was always money in Northern Virginia for a team, and there was never a drawn-up agreement about what was Baltimore's territory and what Washington could have in regard to Major League Baseball. If you want to take this back almost 75 years, and I got to get a swig of coffee here to wet my whistle. I'm going to get my wife to bring me some water here before it's all over with as well. But in 2000, in 2 and 3 and 4, by then the strike had caught up with the Montreal Expos, right? So if you Google the Montreal Expos fans in 2000 and 2001 and 2002, they realized like the strike had devastated Montreal, and they were going to move the team, and they had nowhere to move the team. Unlike football, which had Charlotte, Jacksonville, Memphis, Los Angeles forever lining up, Houston, didn't have a team at the time in football. Baseball didn't have that. Baseball was trying Puerto Rico. Baseball was trying Mexico City. Baseball wasn't working in Tampa. Baseball wasn't working in Miami. Baseball was barely working in Arizona. Baseball was barely working in Denver. All these places that they expanded to, none of those expansion franchises had really worked out exceedingly well for them. And now the Expos needed to be moved. And it felt to the people running baseball that Washington was the only big city, much like Los Angeles now having two teams, right, in football. It was the only place where there wasn't a team. And there was a movement afoot there to say, well, let's do everything we can do to protect Peter. Now, Peter was absolutely hated by the owners because of the strike in 94. So 96, 7, 8, 9, he was hated. He couldn't even walk into they hated his guts. In 2001, it was time to negotiate with the players again. And Peter was an incredible negotiator. He was a lead union negotiator. He offered his pro bono services to his partners to keep labor peace. So Peter came in with Bud Selig as a champion in 2001 and was one of the good guys for the owners to keep the peace. There was no strike. He was a huge part of that because the players liked Peter. Peter took their side. So Peter was a wedge in the negotiation and got it done and saved baseball. He loved to talk about how he saved baseball, but Peter allowed baseball to continue in 2001 with his negotiating skill and thought that I'm good with the owners now. They're never going to do anything to screw me. They're never going to put a team in Washington. Peter's worst nightmare was the Washington Nationals. I mean, you just need to know that. You need to know how he hated everything about the concept of that. And you can go and listen to the tapes. You can hear it all. You can read it all. Tom Boswell's well quoted. Tom Lavera's well quoted. You can go back and read all of it. But the real problem here was antitrust. And the antitrust exemption in Washington, D.C., were senators and congressmen. And you can see today, Google this morning as there's a parade, how many Washington politically connected people love baseball. How many of them are old white guys, old white guy Republicans who love baseball. And they're all celebrating today that Washington has won a title. Those were the very guys, the Lindsey Grahams, the Newt Gingrich types, Jim Bunning was involved back then. Those were all the people who were going to go to war with Major League Baseball over antitrust if Washington didn't get a team. They hated Peter. They hated the losing. They saw the ineptitude of Peter in 2002 and 3 and 4 because it had gone sour. They saw that the Expos were going to be moved, and then there was nowhere to move them. Literally, there was no San Antonio. There was no Portland. There was no Buffalo. There was no Louisville. There was nowhere to move the team. That's why the Nationals exist out of Major League Baseball's ineptitude. They screwed up Montreal, which was a perfectly thriving market for 3 decades after the strike. They went to war with Peter. Peter went to war with them. And then in 2003 and 4, they had nowhere to put that team. And Peter thought, you're my partners, you're not going to screw me. And he thought that he had saved them in the strike in 01 and that would mean you will never do anything to infringe upon my market. And he thought of Washington as his market. And they did. And a lot of this, as I did the research on the book in 2015 and 16, and you can go back and read the work of Mark Fainaru-Wada, and it's very well sourced in my series. And I would encourage all of you, this is the end of I'm 10 minutes away from bidding you guys adieu, but I did a series called MASN for Dummies at WNST.net. It's a 4-part series. I intended to read from it. I actually read it late last night so I could lecture you guys a little bit about it so that I could bring myself back up to speed. But what I really learned about this is that it was more about antitrust than it was about loving Washington or believing a team could succeed in Washington or screwing Peter. This was more like, it worked like this. You guys are either going to put a team in Washington or we are going to come and take your antitrust exemption. Like that really is the crux of how the Nationals existed, because all of the owners were afraid of the antitrust exemption and Discovery and how much money they were all making, because they were all making a lot of money, and in the aftermath of the strike. So the team got put in D.C. and all hell broke loose for Peter. They told Peter they were never going to do it. Then they did it. And then they said to Peter, we'll make you whole. Don't worry, we'll make you whole. Peter Angelos is one of the most miserable human beings to ever walk the face of the earth. He's greedy. He's cantankerous. He has sued everybody and everyone during the course of his lifetime. It's how he's made himself wealthy, is beating people up in lawsuits. It is, ask anyone, ask around. He's 90 years old. There's a 90-year track record on Peter Angelos. And somehow, some way, and this was the quote that Joe Foss, who was then the president of the Orioles, who created MASN, who was the banker in the room in New York in 1993 that created the deal that brought the Orioles. Joe Foss said on the record that Bud Selig and the owners thought that Peter was going to be reasonable. Peter was never going to be reasonable. And Peter wanted blood. Peter was angry. Peter felt double-crossed, whether he was or wasn't in his own mind, whatever it was. But this was really a political decision to move the Washington Nationals from Montreal because of the antitrust exemption. And Mark Fader-Rueda's work in the Washington Post was brilliant. He's been up for Pulitzers, the whole deal. So go read his work in the Washington Post in 2004. He wrote a 5-part series, I believe it was, and it was, effing brilliant on how this happened. And it's not well noted, but it's all true, and it's all well sourced, and I wrote about it in MASN Series for Dummies. That's 4 parts. There's also 2 chapters in the Peter Principles, chapters 12 and 13, that I reference in MASN for Dummies. That's extensive work that I did on how all this happened and the background of the antitrust exemption and the fear of the owners in moving the team. MASN was created to gift Peter money to make him whole for the damage of taking Washington as his market. It was done as a preemptive strike to avoid litigation. It was done so what Peter got in the deal, and these were the terms, okay? In 2004, they decided to move the team. The terms were floor price of $365 million, and I think the escalation was $5 million a year, like that, or maybe it was $10 million a year or something like that. But the floor price of Peter's franchise, that if the bottom fell out, Major League Baseball would have to give him $365 million plus, more every year after 2005. They gave him $75 million in cash in 2 payments, and they gave him MASN. And they gave him 90% ownership stake in MASN, and they gave the Nationals 1 point a year after the first 5 years. We're 15 years into this. If my numbers are correct, I think the numbers are that the Angelos family owns 78% of MASN now, and the Lerner family owns 22% of MASN right now. It's within a percentage point or 2 of that at this point, because every year it backs up a year to where it gets to 67-33, and that year is like 2024 or 34. So the profits are very clear because the Nationals declare them. So every year the Nationals get whatever, 12%, 14%, 16%, now 22% of the profit, whatever's left over. And the Nationals have been very unabashed about displaying that number. And then you can thereby figure out how much money the Angeloses have made. This is the most important part of the lecture. It's the last 5 minutes, and I'm sorry I took 55 minutes getting you to the gate. And at least I've extended incredible reading material for you if you want to read more about this and you want to write and learn more about this. But Sam wrote to me and said, will you lecture me about the MASN money and where it went? So this is the key point, and I think this is the point that the poison pill in this deal, Peter's argument all along was, we're not going to become the Mets of New York. We're not going to be the team that can't afford the best players, because if we don't have the best players, we won't have any fans, right? So his whole argument was, yeah, you're going to put a team in Washington over my dead body, and what you're doing to me is illegal, illicit, immoral, irrational. 2 teams can't exist. Look at the Bay Area. There's not enough money here to support 2 franchises. That was his argument. Then his argument, once it happened, was, you're not going to screw my payroll. I'm not going to not be able to afford my Cal Ripken, my Manny Machado. When we get a Manny Machado around here, we need to have the $40 million so that Manny Machado doesn't wind up in a Padre, or worse yet, down in the Nationals and beating our heads in. And that's the way Peter talked. If you go and listen, that's a hell of a Peter Angelos impersonation. So Peter's poison pill in all of this was this. And this is where it gets dirty. Peter's deal was, we're never going to have the Nationals getting more money out of the TV deal than the Orioles. So what we're going to do, the poison pill is going to be, whatever the Nationals get, the Orioles get. So we're not going to have the Yankees getting $200 million from the Yes Network, and the Mets trying to figure out how to get $30 or $40 million from their cable provider, and therefore the Mets' best players are going to go pitch for the Yankees. That was Peter hated George Steinbrenner. I mean, like, Go back and see the war of words in the New York Times and Murray Chass. I mean, all of this stuff is long forgotten. Like, I hope 20 years from now, I hope Trump isn't forgotten. I hope you all remember what this clown has done. But 20 years later, people have forgotten what Peter has done. But the poison pill was that whatever one team gets, the other team gets. Tom Boswell, God love him and God bless him for living long enough to see last night and writing a story. I tweeted out late at night when Dan Shaughnessy put him up. But Tom Boswell wrote a piece that you all should read. I quoted it widely in my story as well, and there's a link, that said, who will decide how much money the Nationals will get from all of this revenue that MASN's going to create? MASN created $220 million a year of revenue by 2008 that did not exist in 2004. $220 million of your mother, your grandmother, your aunt, people on the Eastern Shore, people in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Virginia, the nation's cap, all of these, all the cable people who had cable boxes were giving $2, $3, $4 a month to Peter Angelos to divvy up with his partners with the Nationals. And instead, that money went into his bank account. And since then, for the last 13 years in the New York Supreme Court, he has fought to keep all of the money on his side and to minimize how little he would have to give the Nationals, which then immediately means that's how little he'd have to give the Orioles. So Peter Angelos has artificially suppressed his own franchise's payroll because the little he can give the Nationals is as little he can give the Orioles. And the other part of this, and this was really the poison pill, is that whatever the MASN tree feeds the Nationals and feeds the Orioles, 34% of that then goes into the Major League Baseball kitty. So the local cable revenue, the more you give the Nationals, the more you give the Orioles, the more they then have to split with the other 29 partners. So Peter has done everything in his power to pay the Nationals as little as possible, which means he's paid the Orioles as little as possible, which means that his family's profit and keeping all of that MASN money away from Major League Baseball and just on the side of the Angelos family. And that is the moral of the story. That is how to take $4 billion over the last 15 years and make a magic act. And that is how you get a Nationals parade. And that's how you get 108 losses and Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal. It's the end of my lecture. I hope it didn't suck. Hey, dude's got a bag. Is that a bag for your head? Put that on, man. I want to screenshot that. I love it. I love it. Hang on. Let me screenshot it. Yeah, please do. Yeah, absolutely, man. This is what makes life worth living, is that dissent is very American. I want you to remember that, all of you. Okay, so here we go. I appreciate you guys. And how many of you are Nationals fans? How many are like really celebrating? Like, come on, you don't look like you're happy. My wife's one of those. Hey, thanks for being a great audience, and for all of you Googling other stuff, I hope you paid a half attention. I love you, millennials.